soft hum of my computer filled the room as the lines of code flickered on the monitor in front of me. The numbers and symbols blurred after hours of staring at them, but I kept typing. My coffee had long gone cold, still sitting on the coaster Claire gave me last Christmas. It said, Code Wizard Extraordinaire. I smiled faintly at the thought. She'd found it at some tourist trap during one of her impromptu date afternoons downtown, insisting it was perfect for me. A part of me wondered if she remembered where she'd bought it. It was late. The kind of late where the quiet felt suffocating, pressing in on you with all the weight of things you didn't want to think about. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane, but the real chill was inside me. I caught the time on the corner of my screen, 12:42 a.m. Damn it, I muttered, stretching my arms above my head. My back ached from sitting for too long, and my body reminded me that 42 wasn't as forgiving as 32. I reached for the coffee cup before thinking better of it. It had been stale hours ago. Standing, I rubbed my temples and grabbed my phone off the desk. No texts from Claire. She must have gone to bed early. It had been happening more often lately, her slipping away quietly, as if she wanted to avoid me noticing. I chalked it up to stress. Work, kids, life. It wears everyone down, doesn't it? Our house was dark except for the faint glow spilling out from the hallway night light. I walked toward the kitchen, hoping to clear my head with a glass of water before calling it a night. That's when I heard it, a faint laugh. Hers. I froze. The sound hit me like a fist in the chest, not because it was out of place, but because it wasn't. That laugh. I knew it too well. The one that bubbled up when she was truly enjoying herself, carefree, unguarded. The one I hadn't heard in months. Slowly, I moved toward the sound, careful to keep my steps quiet. The laugh came again, followed by her voice, lowered but still carrying that edge of amusement. Can you believe he still hasn't figured it out? He's so damn predictable. I stopped in the shadow of the stairwell. My blood turned to ice, but I didn't move. My mind tried to fill in blanks that didn't exist. She was probably joking about something innocent. Something trivial. He's working late again, she continued, her tone softer now, intimate. You know how he gets. I could tell him I was running away tomorrow, and he'd just nod and say, we'll talk about it later. The ache in my chest grew sharper, spreading like a cancer. My feet refused to move forward. I stayed rooted in place, my breaths shallow and uneven. She was on the phone. That much was clear. But with who? Then came the name, dropped so casually it might as well have been a knife. Bruce. Bruce. I didn't need a last name. My best friend. The godfather to our son. The man who'd stood beside me at our wedding, clinking glasses in a toast to everlasting love. Bruce. My legs felt weak, and I had to grip the banister for support. Every fiber of me wanted to burst into the kitchen, yank that phone out of her hand, demand an explanation. But something held me back. A whisper of self-preservation, maybe. Or perhaps the knowledge that I wasn't ready for whatever came next. I miss you, she said softly. The words felt like stones sinking in my gut. This weekend? God, I'd love that. It's been too long. The sound of her voice turned saccharine, the kind of tone she hadn't used with me in years. I'll wear that black dress you love so much. You know the one. I retreated up the stairs before I could hear anything else. My hands were shaking. My breath came in ragged bursts, and the hallway blurred as I stumbled back to my office. The second I closed the door behind me, I let out a strangled sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. I sat heavily in my chair, my mind racing with questions that felt impossible to answer. Was this the first time? Had it been going on for years? Why him? Why the man who'd helped me move into this house, who'd celebrated the births of my children? The kids. The thought made me sick. Thomas was 14, Ella 12, and little Nate only 9. My entire world had revolved around them. I loved being a dad, family dinners, Saturday morning soccer games, helping with science fair projects. It was the only thing that had ever felt truly right. But now that world felt fragile. Breakable. I opened my laptop, hesitated, then typed Bruce's name into the search bar. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe some indication that this wasn't real. A photo of him happy with his wife, proof that he wasn't the man Claire had whispered to late at night. Instead, I found the opposite, a gallery of professional headshots, social media posts, and smiling faces at charity events. His life looked perfect, polished to a gleam. But then again, so had mine. I stared at the glowing screen, paralyzed by the enormity of what I'd heard. Part of me wanted to throw the laptop across the room, but I didn't. I needed clarity. Answers. Proof. I grabbed my phone, scrolled to my contact list, and found Bruce's number. My thumb hovered over the call button. What would I even say? Hey, Bruce, funny thing. My wife just confessed she's screwing you. Care to confirm? Instead, I turned off the screen, setting the phone face down on the desk. The weight in my chest pressed harder, suffocating me. For the first time in my life, I didn't know where to start. The next morning came too soon. Sleep had been out of reach, teasing me from the edges of my exhaustion. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, watching the sun rise through the window. The golden light warmed the room, making everything feel surreal, like the world was playing some cruel trick, pretending everything was fine. Claire breezed in wearing her usual morning smile, her blonde hair tied back in a messy bun, looking as though the previous night's whispers hadn't existed. She moved with the same practiced grace, pouring herself a cup of coffee before leaning against the counter. "Morning," she said casually, taking a sip. I studied her, searching for any sign of guilt or hesitation. There was none. Just her usual ease, like she hadn't been plotting to wear a dress for another man or laugh at my expense. My knuckles whitened around the mug, but I forced a smile, keeping my voice steady. "Morning." Ella stumbled in next, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Dad, I can't find my backpack." "It's in the hallway, where you always leave it," Claire said, her tone effortlessly maternal. Ella groaned and wandered off, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Claire chuckled, shaking her head. That kid would lose her head if it wasn't attached. I grunted in agreement, though my mind was a storm of accusations. How could she laugh like that, so easily? How could she stand there and make small talk with me, knowing what she'd said to Bruce last night? I wanted to confront her, demand the truth, but the kids were waking up, and they didn't deserve that. Not yet. When Thomas came down the stairs, his phone already glued to his hand, I ruffled his hair on his way to the table. "Morning, bud." He muttered something that might have been morning without looking up. Nate followed close behind, dragging his favorite blanket and plopping down in his usual chair. It was a picture-perfect family breakfast. Except I knew better now. Claire slid a plate of toast and scrambled eggs in front of Nate before sitting across from me. Her smile stayed in place, but for the first time, I noticed how calculated it was. Not a flicker of unease passed across her face, but I felt it now, the performance. How much of our life had been like this? A carefully constructed facade while I worked late nights, oblivious? I stabbed at my own breakfast, chewing mechanically. My appetite was gone, replaced by a simmering nausea that made it hard to swallow. "I was thinking of taking the kids to the park later," Claire said, glancing at me. "You could join us if you're not too busy." Busy. I almost laughed. Was that the excuse she'd been using with Bruce? Oh, Daniel's busy. He won't even notice. I'll try, I said, the words hollow. Got a lot on my plate today. She nodded like she'd expected that answer, but I caught something else. A flicker of relief, so brief I almost missed it. By the time the kids were off to school, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for hours. Claire kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, her lips brushing my skin like nothing had changed. But it had. Everything had. As the door shut behind her, I sank into a chair, running a hand over my face. My pulse thundered in my ears. I couldn't sit here anymore. Couldn't let the weight of it crush me. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts again. Mark Halstead. The name had been given to me years ago by a friend who'd gone through a bitter divorce. He's ruthless, but he'll get you answers, they'd said. At the time, I hadn't thought I'd ever need someone like him. Now I wasn't so sure. Before I could overthink it, I tapped his number. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Halstead. This is Daniel Cross. I need your help. I met Mark in a dingy coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where nobody pays attention to anyone else. He looked exactly how I imagined, balding, a bit rough around the edges, wearing a cheap suit that somehow still managed to look professional. His eyes were sharp, assessing me in a single glance as I slid into the booth across from him. Mr. Cross, he said, folding his hands on the table. What can I do for you? I need to know if my wife is having an affair. The words felt foreign in my mouth, but once they were out, they took on a life of their own. I don't just want to know. I want proof. I need everything. Mark didn't blink. How long have you suspected? Last night, I admitted. I overheard her on the phone with a man named Bruce. She said. I hesitated, the memory still too raw. She said things that made it clear she's been lying to me for a long time. Mark nodded, pulling a small notepad from his jacket. And you want to find out how long, what she's hiding, and if there's more to it? Yes. My voice cracked slightly, but I didn't care. I need the truth. His pen scratched against the paper. Do you have access to her phone? She keeps it locked, but she's not careful. I've seen her code. Good. We'll start there. I'll need her number, any routine habits, and details about this Bruce guy. Last name? Barrett. Bruce Barrett. Mark's pen stopped, and he looked up at me. The financial advisor? You know him? I know of him. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. High profile, charming, and connected. The kind of guy who thinks he's untouchable. That's him. Mark pocketed the notepad. I'll get to work. Keep everything as normal as possible. Don't confront her yet. Let me do the digging. His words settled over me like a cold blanket. Keep everything normal. Smile. Pretend. It felt impossible, but I nodded anyway. Anything else? I asked. Mark studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Whatever you think you know right now, Mr. Cross? Be prepared. It's always worse than you expect. The drive home felt longer than usual, the weight of Mark's words sinking in deeper with each passing mile. Whatever I thought I knew about Claire, about my marriage, about my life, it wasn't the truth. Not yet. But I'd find it. And when I did, I wouldn't hold back. I didn't sleep that night. My body sat in the office chair, but my mind replayed her words on an endless loop. Can you believe he still hasn't figured it out? Each syllable was a needle, each laugh a blade. I tried to distract myself with work, but the monitor's glow became unbearable. It felt like it was mocking me. The keyboard under my fingers felt alien, the letters meaningless. So, I did what I hadn't done in years. I poured a drink. Whiskey. Cheap, bitter, but strong enough to drown my thoughts for a few minutes. The kids woke up before Claire. Their laughter filled the kitchen as I made pancakes, my hands going through the motions like muscle memory. Thomas teased Ella about the way she piled syrup on her plate. Nate tugged at my shirt, asking if we could play catch after school. I smiled. I laughed. I nodded. I lied. Claire appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, wearing one of those oversized sweaters that made her look effortlessly beautiful. She kissed Nate on the top of his head, then walked over to me. Her lips brushed my cheek like they had 1,000 times before. "You didn't come to bed," she said softly. "Got caught up in work," I replied, flipping a pancake. My voice betrayed nothing. Years of presentations, of boardroom negotiations, had taught me how to sound calm even when my world was crumbling. Her hand lingered on my arm for a moment. "You need to take care of yourself, Daniel." I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She looked concerned. Caring. A perfect actress in her role as wife and mother. The urge to confront her was like a tidal wave, pulling me under. But I couldn't, not here, not in front of the kids. I needed time to think, to plan. I'd learned long ago that reacting without a strategy was a fool's game. She moved to the table, pouring herself coffee and laughing as Nate recounted a story about his Lego set. Watching her was like observing a stranger. I didn't know who she was anymore. Maybe I never had. After the kids left for school, I called off work. Claire gave me a concerned look as she grabbed her purse. "Are you feeling okay?" she asked. "Just a headache." "I'll be fine. Text me if you need anything," she said, and just like that, she was gone. Off to the hospital for another shift as a pediatric nurse, or so she claimed. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The moment the door clicked shut, I felt the emptiness of the house press down on me. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and scrolled to my contact list. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called a name I hadn't thought of in years, Mark Halstead. Mark wasn't the kind of man you'd want to meet in a dark alley. His voice on the other end of the line was a mix of gravel and disdain, like he didn't have time for bullshit. He'd retired from the police force a decade ago and now worked as a private investigator. He'd helped a friend of mine through a messy divorce, uncovering things that made my situation look like child's play. "Dan Cross," he said after a beat. "Haven't heard your name in years. What's this about?" I hesitated, then forced the words out. "I think my wife's having an affair." There was a pause. I could hear him lighting a cigarette. "That's a shitty hand to be dealt. Who's the other guy?" "Bruce Barrett." He let out a low whistle. "Your buddy Bruce?" Jesus Christ, Dan. That's ice cold. I felt my jaw tighten. "Can you help me or not?" "Yeah, I can help," he said. "But you need to be clear about something." "What I find?" "You can't unsee it." "You sure you're ready for this?" I closed my eyes and thought of Claire's laugh, of the kids, of the years I'd spent building a life with her. "Yeah," I said, my voice hard. "I'm ready." Mark didn't waste time. He showed up at my house the next day, dressed in a worn leather jacket and carrying a laptop bag. His face was leaner than I remembered, his eyes sharper. He had the look of a man who'd seen too much but never let it break him. We sat in my office, the blinds drawn, as he set up his equipment. "Here's how this works," he said, tapping away at his laptop. "I'll monitor her phone, her emails, track her location. Legally, it's a gray area, but no one ever questions the results. My stomach churned as I watched him work. It felt invasive, wrong. But then I thought of the phone call, of the lies, and the hesitation disappeared. "What about Bruce?" I asked. Mark smirked. "Already ahead of you." I pulled up some preliminary background on him. He turned the laptop to face me. "This guy's been busy. Offshore accounts. Meetings at luxury hotels. He's not just screwing your wife, Dan. He's playing a much bigger game." I stared at the screen, the words blurring together. Offshore accounts. Falsified records. Expenses tied to properties I'd never heard of. What the hell is all this? Money laundering, embezzlement, maybe more. "I'm still digging," Mark said. "But here's the kicker, your mother's name popped up in some of the transactions." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "What?" "She's been funneling money through one of Bruce's shell companies." "My guess?" "She's been helping him cover his tracks." My chest tightened. My mother? Margaret Cross? She'd always been controlling, always obsessed with appearances, but this? This was a level of betrayal I hadn't even considered. "I'll get you everything," Mark said, his tone steady. "Emails, financials, pictures if I can. But you need to be prepared, Dan. This is gonna get ugly." I nodded, though the truth was I didn't feel ready. How could anyone be ready for something like this? Still, there was no turning back. Not now. Mark packed up his gear and headed out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The house felt colder than usual, the silence heavier. I looked out the window at the yard where the kids used to play. The memories felt like someone else's life. When Claire came home that evening, she kissed me on the cheek and asked how my day was. I smiled and said, "Fine." It wasn't a lie, not anymore. I wasn't fine. I was something else. Something colder, harder. I was a man ready for the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Mark worked fast. Over the next few days, he sent me snippets of evidence, little breadcrumbs that led straight to the heart of the betrayal. It was worse than I imagined. Claire and Bruce weren't just having an affair, they were strategic, methodical, weaving a web of lies around me so tight that I hadn't seen the cracks until now. Bank statements, email exchanges, and carefully curated meeting schedules painted a picture of two people who thought they were untouchable. And my mother? She was the architect of their safety net, her meticulous planning ensuring they could play house while keeping me in the dark. On a cold Wednesday evening, Mark called me, his voice sharper than usual. "Dan, I've got something. I think you need to see it in person." I met him in a coffee shop 2 towns over, the kind of place where no one would think twice about two men speaking in hushed tones. Mark sat in the back corner, his laptop open and a stack of papers spread across the table. "Let's start with this," he said, sliding a manila folder toward me. "Emails between your mother and Claire, dating back 15 years. I opened the folder, my hands trembling. The first email hit me like a gut punch. "Margaret, I understand your hesitation, but Bruce is the better long-term choice. Daniel is stable, dependable, but Bruce can give you the excitement you crave. Let's figure out a way to make this work for everyone." My stomach churned as I flipped through the emails. My mother, the woman who had raised me, had actively encouraged Claire to pursue Bruce, before we were even married. She'd decided I was dependable but not enough. Like I was some piece of furniture to be left in a corner while they designed the perfect room around me. "They played you from the start," Mark said, his voice low but firm. "Your mother wanted to maintain control, and Bruce, well, Bruce is Bruce. Charming, manipulative, and greedy. Why would she do this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would she betray her own son?" Mark leaned back, lighting a cigarette despite the no-smoking sign. Power, Dan. It's always about power. Your mother's been running your life like it's a goddamn chess game. Bruce and Claire were just pieces on the board. I stared at the papers, the weight of it all pressing down on me. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systemic, deliberate. Every moment of my life with Claire had been orchestrated, planned to benefit everyone except me. Mark wasn't done. He pulled up surveillance footage on his laptop, angling it so I could see the screen. This was 2 nights ago, he said, pressing play. The video showed a dimly lit parking garage. Claire stepped out of her car, her black dress clinging to her like second skin. Moments later, Bruce arrived in his sleek Mercedes, grinning like the arrogant bastard he was. They met near the elevators, his hand immediately finding her waist. She laughed, tilting her head back as he whispered something in her ear. They kissed. I felt the rage build in my chest, sharp and searing. Watching them was like staring into the sun, too bright, too raw. I wanted to reach through the screen and drag Bruce out of that car, beat the smugness off his face. Mark watched me carefully. You want me to keep going? I nodded, my jaw tight. Show me everything. The rest of the week passed in a haze. I went through the motions at home, smiling at the kids, sitting through family dinners, listening to Claire talk about her day as if nothing had changed. But every word she spoke felt like a lie. Every smile was a mask. One night, as we sat in the living room watching TV, she leaned her head against my shoulder. I froze, my body rigid. It felt wrong, intimate but hollow, like a gesture from a ghost. I stayed still, letting her think everything was fine, but inside I was unraveling. Mark called me again on Friday. His tone was different this time, serious, almost hesitant. I've got the DNA results, he said. My stomach dropped. And? There was a long pause before he answered. None of them are yours, Dan. Not Thomas, not Ella, not Nate. The room spun around me. My knees buckled, and I sank into the chair by my desk. I'd prepared myself for this possibility, told myself it was a chance, but hearing it was different. Knowing it was different. Mark continued, his voice softer now. Bruce had the tests done years ago. There's a trail of documentation. He's known all along, and so has Claire. I felt the air leave my lungs. They'd known. For years. And they let me believe this lie, let me raise those kids, love them like they were my own. My hands clenched into fists, the rage bubbling to the surface. Dan? Mark's voice pulled me back. What do you want to do with this? I didn't answer right away. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and memories. The kids' first steps, their school plays, the nights spent reading bedtime stories. None of it felt any less real. But it was all built on a foundation of deceit. I'll handle it, I said finally, my voice cold and steady. Just give me everything you have. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, a glass of whiskey in my hand. I stared at the family photos on the mantel, the smiling faces that now felt like strangers. Claire's laugh echoed in my mind, but this time it wasn't warm or comforting. It was cruel, mocking. She came downstairs around midnight, her bare feet padding softly against the hardwood floor. When she saw me, she hesitated. "You're still up?" she asked. I took a long sip of whiskey before answering. "Yeah. Just thinking." She crossed the room and sat on the couch across from me, tucking her legs beneath her. "You've seemed distant lately. Is everything okay?" I looked at her, really looked at her. She was still beautiful, still the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But now, I saw the cracks, the lies hiding behind her eyes. I've been thinking about us, I said carefully. About the last 15 years. How much we've been through together. She smiled faintly, but there was a flicker of something else. Fear? Guilt? We've had a good life, haven't we? I leaned forward, setting my glass on the table. Have we, Claire? Her smile faltered. What kind of question is that? I didn't answer. I just watched her, waiting for her to slip, to give herself away. But she didn't. Not yet. That was fine. The time for answers would come soon enough. The next morning, I woke up with clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Claire was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, flipping pancakes for the kids. Her laughter rang out as Nate recounted one of his over-the-top stories, and for a fleeting moment, the scene looked perfect. A Norman Rockwell painting brought to life. But I knew better now. Perfection, I'd learned, was a lie. She looked up when I entered, her face lighting up with that same smile I used to love. Now it felt like a mask, a well-practiced expression designed to hide the truth. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said. "You're up late." I grabbed a cup of coffee and forced a smile. Guess I needed the extra rest. Her eyes flicked to me, just for a second, before she turned her attention back to the stove. I wondered if she could feel it, the weight of my gaze, the storm building behind my calm facade. The kids left for school a half hour later, their laughter fading as the front door clicked shut. Claire lingered by the sink, washing the last of the dishes. I stood in the doorway, watching her. She hummed under her breath, a soft, familiar tune. For a moment, I almost believed it. The life we'd built, the years we'd shared, they felt so real. But then I remembered the phone call. The emails. The DNA tests. "Claire," I said, my voice steady but sharp enough to make her pause. She turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Yeah?" I stepped into the kitchen, closing the distance between us. My chest felt tight, every muscle coiled with tension. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered, replaced by something cautious. "Okay, about what?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen, ready to pull up the photos, the emails, the proof. But I hesitated. "Not yet." I slid the phone back into my pocket and met her gaze. "Do you ever think about the choices we've made? Over the years, I mean." She frowned slightly, tilting her head. "What brought this on?" I shrugged, trying to keep my tone casual. "Just been thinking about the kids, our life together. Wondering if we're where we thought we'd be." Her expression softened, the caution melting away. "I think we've done pretty well, all things considered. Don't you?" I didn't respond, just studied her face, searching for cracks in the facade. If she felt any guilt, any shame, she hid it well. Or maybe she'd been hiding it for so long that it came naturally. "Yeah," I said finally, forcing a smile. "I guess you're right." I spent the rest of the day in my office, reviewing Mark's latest findings. The more I read, the more the pieces fell into place. Bruce wasn't just a homewrecker, he was a thief. Over the years, he'd siphoned money from shared accounts, funneling it through shell companies and offshore accounts. Some of those transactions were tied to Claire, her name scrawled across documents I'd never seen. And then there was my mother, her fingerprints all over the financial web that kept Bruce's empire afloat. It was a masterpiece of deceit. A betrayal so intricate, so deliberate, that it made my blood boil. Mark's voice echoed in my mind. "What I find? You can't unsee it." He was right. I couldn't unsee it. Couldn't unfeel it. Claire was already in bed when I came upstairs that night. She was scrolling through her phone, the soft glow illuminating her face. When she saw me, she set the phone down and smiled. "You okay?" she asked. "You've been quiet today." I climbed into bed beside her, the mattress dipping under my weight. For a moment, I just looked at her, wondering how I'd missed it for so long. The lies. The manipulation. She'd built a life with me while building a life with him, and I hadn't seen it. "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired." She reached out, her hand brushing against mine. Her touch used to bring me comfort. Now it felt hollow. Empty. "Get some rest," she said softly. "You've been working too hard." I didn't reply. I just closed my eyes and waited for her breathing to slow, for the room to fill with the quiet rhythm of her sleep. When I was sure she wouldn't wake, I slipped out of bed and headed back to my office. The darkness felt heavier tonight, the walls pressing in on me. I sat at my desk, staring at the stack of evidence Mark had given me. Emails. Photos. Financial records. It was all there, laid out in excruciating detail. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment I'd been made a fool of. I picked up the photo from the parking garage, the one of Claire and Bruce. They were laughing, their bodies close, their hands intertwined. It was a moment of intimacy that didn't belong to me. My hand trembled as I set the photo back down. The anger burned hot and bright, but beneath it was something darker. Something colder. I wasn't just angry. I was ready. The next morning, I called Mark. "It's time," I said. "For what?" he asked. I stared at the photo on my desk, my jaw tightening. "For them to see what I've seen. For everyone to see." Mark didn't hesitate. "I'll get everything ready." The days that followed were a blur of preparation. I worked late into the night, compiling the evidence, making sure every detail was accounted for. This wasn't just about Claire and Bruce anymore. It was about the whole damn system, the lies, the manipulation, the arrogance. They thought they could get away with it. They thought I'd never find out. They were wrong. By the time the weekend rolled around, I had a plan. Thanksgiving was next week, and Claire had already invited the usual crowd, Bruce and his wife, my mother, a handful of family friends. It was tradition, a tradition I'd once cherished. This year, it would be different. This year, it would be their reckoning. The day of reckoning came wrapped in the usual pretense of family gatherings. Thanksgiving. The holiday meant to celebrate gratitude and togetherness, but this year, it was a stage. A carefully orchestrated performance where I held the script, and everyone else was oblivious. The morning started like any other. Claire was up early, bustling around the kitchen in her favorite apron, the one with cartoon turkeys printed on it. The kids helped set the table, their excitement infectious. Watching them, I felt a pang of guilt. None of this was their fault. They didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire, but there was no avoiding it. Not anymore. By the time the guests arrived, the house was filled with the smell of roasted turkey and fresh-baked pies. Margaret was the first to walk through the door, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she handed me her famous pumpkin pie. "Everything looks wonderful, Daniel," she said, patting my arm. Her voice carried that tone she always used, the one that made every compliment feel like a subtle critique. "Thanks, Mom," I replied, forcing a smile. My stomach churned just looking at her. I knew what she'd done, the role she'd played in all of this. But she didn't know I knew. Not yet. Bruce and his wife, Meredith, arrived next. He strode into the house with his usual confidence, a bottle of expensive wine in hand. His smile was wide, disarming, like he hadn't spent years dismantling my life behind my back. "Dan," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm, his eyes too knowing. "Another year, huh?" Always good to see you. You too, Bruce, I said, my voice steady. I glanced at Claire, who had appeared behind me with a platter of appetizers. She greeted Bruce with that same warm smile she used to reserve for me. It took everything in me not to lash out right then and there. Dinner was a spectacle. The dining table, set with the best china, groaned under the weight of the feast. Conversation flowed easily, filled with the usual banalities, updates on work, the kids, plans for the holidays. Claire laughed often, her charm on full display. Margaret chimed in with stories about her latest charity projects, her voice dripping with self-importance. Bruce sat across from me, his hand casually resting on Meredith's arm as he regaled the table with a story about his latest business venture. The man was a natural performer, his every word calculated to keep the room enthralled. I bided my time, letting the evening unfold like any other Thanksgiving. The wine flowed, the kids disappeared upstairs, and the laughter grew louder. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. I could feel it in every glance, every smile. They didn't know it yet, but the illusion was about to shatter. After dessert, I stood, raising my glass for a toast. The room quieted, all eyes turning to me. I'd rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, but now that it was here, I felt the weight of it settle over me. I just want to say how thankful I am for all of you, I began, my voice steady. Family means everything to me. It always has. Claire smiled at me, her eyes soft. Bruce raised his glass in agreement. Margaret nodded, looking pleased. But, I continued, letting the word hang in the air, family is about more than blood. It's about trust. Loyalty. Honesty. The room grew still. Claire's smile faltered. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Bruce shifted in his chair. I reached under my plate and pulled out a manila envelope. The sight of it was like a bomb ticking down, the tension in the room becoming palpable. What's that? Claire asked, her voice laced with unease. Something I've been meaning to share, I said. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first photograph, Claire and Bruce in the parking garage, their bodies close, their faces too familiar. I held it up for everyone to see. Silence. What the hell is this? Bruce's voice cut through the room, his usual composure cracking. Claire's face drained of color. Daniel, where did you? Don't, I snapped, cutting her off. My voice was sharp, colder than I'd ever heard it. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel, maybe this isn't the time. Oh, it's the perfect time, I said, turning to her. You've spent 15 years orchestrating this. You thought you could control me, manipulate my life, decide what's best for me. Well, congratulations, Mom. You got everything you wanted. And now, I'm taking it all back. Claire stood, her hands trembling. Daniel, please. Let's talk about this. I slammed another photo on the table. The DNA results. Talk about what, Claire? The fact that none of these kids are mine? Or the fact that you've been lying to me since the day we met? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. She wasn't the victim here. I was done playing the fool. The room erupted into chaos. Margaret tried to defend herself, her voice shrill. Bruce stammered, his confidence crumbling as Meredith glared at him, her face twisted in shock. Claire broke down, pleading with me to stop, but I didn't. I laid everything out. The emails, the financial records, the surveillance footage. Every lie, every betrayal, every detail they thought I'd never uncover. By the time I finished, the room was in shambles. Meredith stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Margaret sat frozen, her face pale. Claire sank to the floor, sobbing into her hands. And Bruce? He just stared at me, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. "You think this makes you better than me?" he spat. "Dragging everyone through the mud like this?" I leaned across the table, my voice low and venomous. "You did this, Bruce. Not me. You and Claire and my mother. You built this house of cards, and now it's collapsing. Don't you dare blame me for that." The aftermath was a blur. Margaret left without a word, her usual air of superiority replaced by silence. Bruce followed soon after, his face a mask of rage. Claire tried to talk to me, her voice desperate, but I couldn't stand to look at her. When the house was finally empty, I sat alone in the wreckage of the dining room. The plates were still on the table, the half-eaten turkey growing cold. My hands trembled as I poured another glass of whiskey, the weight of everything pressing down on me. It was over. The lies, the deception, the betrayal, it was all out in the open now. But the cost? I wasn't sure I'd ever recover from it. The house was silent after everyone left. Claire had retreated to the bedroom, her footsteps slow and heavy as she climbed the stairs. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Instead, I sat at the dining table, staring at the remnants of the night, a half-empty bottle of wine, a pile of discarded napkins, and the shattered expressions that still lingered in the air. I downed the last of my whiskey, the burn doing nothing to dull the ache in my chest. It wasn't grief. Not exactly. It was something darker. Something raw. Betrayal had hollowed me out, leaving only anger to fill the void. Claire appeared in the doorway an hour later, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She held herself stiffly, like she was bracing for impact. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I didn't look at her. My eyes were fixed on the glass in my hand, the amber liquid swirling lazily. "Now you want to talk? Daniel, please." She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "I need to explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, cutting her off. My voice was sharp, venomous. "Explain how you've been lying to me for 15 years? How you let me believe those kids were mine while you were screwing my best friend." Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. "Not anymore." "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed bitterly. "Then tell me, Claire. What was it like? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn clear." She sank into the chair across from me, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "It started as a mistake. A stupid, reckless mistake." I stared at her, waiting for her to continue. She didn't. "That's it?" I said. "That's your explanation? A mistake? That's what you call 15 years of lies?" Tears streamed down her face, but I refused to feel pity. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said, her voice breaking. "Bruce, he was there when you weren't. You were always working, always so focused on your company. I felt invisible." I slammed my glass down on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "So this is my fault now? You're blaming me?" "No," she cried, shaking her head. "I'm not blaming you. I'm trying to make you understand." "Understand?" I leaned forward, my voice low and dangerous. "You want me to understand why you lied to me about my entire life? Why you let me love those kids, raise them, while knowing they weren't mine?" Her sobs grew louder, her body shaking with the force of them. But I didn't soften. I couldn't. "I thought you'd leave me," she said, her words choked. "If you found out, I thought I'd lose everything." "You should've," I said coldly. "You should have lost everything the moment you decided I wasn't enough." She flinched, her tears falling freely now. For a moment, the silence between us was deafening. Then she spoke, her voice trembling. I love you, Daniel. The words hit me like a slap. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You don't get to say that, I said, my voice shaking with fury. You don't get to sit here and tell me you love me after everything you've done. She reached for me, but I stepped back, out of her grasp. Her touch felt like poison now, something I couldn't let near me. I'll sleep in the guest room, she said finally, her voice hollow. We can figure this out tomorrow. There's nothing to figure out, I said. It's over. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my office, staring at the photo of Thomas, Ella, and Nate on my desk. They were smiling, their arms draped around each other, the perfect picture of innocence. None of this was their fault. They didn't ask for this. But they were part of the lie, whether they knew it or not. I felt a pang of guilt as I thought about what this would do to them. They weren't mine, not by blood. But I couldn't stop loving them. I hated Claire for what she'd done, hated Bruce for his betrayal, but the kids? They were innocent. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mark. Yeah, he answered, his voice groggy. I need to talk to you, I said. In person. Mark met me at the diner just after sunrise. The place was quiet, the early morning crowd still trickling in. He slid into the booth across from me, a cup of coffee in hand. You look like hell, he said. Feel like it too. He leaned back, studying me. You ready to end this? I nodded. Yeah. It's time. Mark reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. This is everything. The financial records, the emails, the DNA results. You've got all the proof you need. I stared at the folder, my chest tightening. This was it. The final nail in the coffin. Once I opened it, there was no turning back. What's your plan? Mark asked, his voice steady. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the edge of the folder. I don't know yet. Mark frowned. Dan, you've got to think this through. You can't just burn it all down without a plan. I looked up at him, my jaw clenched. I don't care about them anymore. I just want the truth to come out. Let them deal with the fallout. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. Just make sure you're ready for the fallout too. When I got home, the house was quiet. Claire was still asleep in the guest room, the door shut tight. I went to the kids' rooms, checking on each of them. Thomas was sprawled across his bed, his headphones still on. Ella's room was a mess, her sketchbook open on the floor. Nate was curled up under his blanket, clutching his stuffed bear. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my heart aching. They didn't deserve this. But neither did I. The next few days were a blur of preparation. I met with a lawyer, started securing my accounts, and made arrangements for the house. By the time the weekend rolled around, I had everything I needed. The reckoning was coming. And this time, I wouldn't hold back. Sunday morning broke gray and cold, the kind of weather that settles deep in your bones. It felt fitting. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the frost creep along the edges of the glass, my coffee untouched on the counter beside me. Claire came down the stairs just after 8. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, her face bare of makeup. She looked tired, older somehow, the weight of everything dragging her down. Morning, she said, her voice tentative. I didn't answer. I just kept staring out the window. She hesitated, then moved to the coffee pot, pouring herself a cup. The silence between us was thick, suffocating. Finally, she broke it. What happens now? I turned to her, my jaw tightening. What happens now is you pack your things. Her hands trembled, the coffee sloshing over the edge of her cup. Daniel, please. Don't do this. You did this, I said, my voice cold. Not me. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked at me like she was trying to find the right thing to say, the right way to fix this. But there was no fixing it. Not anymore. I want you gone by the end of the week, I said. I've already talked to a lawyer. The papers are being drawn up. Daniel, we can work through this. No, I cut her off, my voice sharp. You don't get to work through 15 years of betrayal. You don't get to lie to me, steal from me, and then act like we can just move past it. Her tears started then, streaming down her face as she clutched the counter for support. I never wanted to hurt you. I laughed bitterly. You never wanted to get caught. She flinched at that, her sobs growing louder. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, to reach out and offer some kind of comfort. But I couldn't. Not when the image of her and Bruce was still burned into my mind. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Save it, I said, turning away. I don't want your apologies. I want my life back. The kids came home from a friend's house that afternoon, oblivious to the storm brewing under their roof. Thomas was talking about a project for school, Ella was sketching something in her notebook, and Nate was chasing the dog around the living room. Watching them, I felt that same pang of guilt I'd been carrying since the truth came out. They didn't deserve this. They deserved stability, security. But I couldn't give them that anymore. Not with Claire here. That night, after they went to bed, I called them one by one into my office. I started with Thomas, the oldest. He sat across from me, his arms crossed, his expression wary. Am I in trouble? He asked. No, I said, my voice soft. You're not in trouble. He relaxed slightly but still looked unsure. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. There's something I need to tell you, I said. Something that's going to change things. His brow furrowed. What is it? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. How did you explain something like this to a 14-year-old? How did you tell him that everything he thought he knew about his family was a lie? Your mom and we're separating, I said finally. His eyes widened. What? Why? It's complicated, I said. But I need you to know that it's not your fault. None of this is your fault. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. You're not telling me everything. No, I admitted. I'm not. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is bullshit. Thomas. No, he snapped, his voice rising. You're breaking up our family, and you won't even tell me why. I reached for him, but he pulled away, his eyes blazing with anger. I hate you. The words hit like a punch to the gut. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Ella was next. She came in quietly, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She sat down without a word, her eyes wide and nervous. What's going on? She asked. I told her the same thing I told Thomas, trying to keep my voice calm. She listened, her expression unreadable. Does this mean we have to move? She asked after a moment. No, I said. You'll stay here. Nothing's going to change for you. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. Okay. Ella, I said gently. Are you okay? She shrugged, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. Nate was the hardest. He climbed onto my lap, his little arms wrapping around my neck. Why are you sad, Daddy? He asked, his voice soft. I held him close, my throat tight. Sometimes grown-ups have problems they can't fix, I said. But I love you. Don't ever forget that. He nodded against my chest, his small hand clutching my shirt. I love you too. That night, I sat in the living room, the silence pressing down on me. Claire came down the stairs, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. I told them, I said without looking at her. She nodded slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. How did they take it? Not well. Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked like she was about to break. But then she straightened, her chin lifting slightly. I'll pack my things, she said. I'll find somewhere to stay. I nodded, my chest tight. Good. She turned to leave, but then she paused, her voice trembling. Daniel, for what it's worth. I loved you. I still do. I didn't answer. I just stared at the floor, the weight of her words sinking into me like stones. The next few days were a blur of packing, tense silences, and careful avoidance. Claire kept to herself, moving quietly from room to room, sorting through 15 years of life and cramming it into boxes. She didn't speak to me unless it was necessary, and I didn't make any effort to bridge the gap. We were strangers now, two people tied together by the wreckage of what once was. The kids sensed the tension, even if they didn't fully understand it. Thomas barely looked at me, his anger simmering just below the surface. Ella retreated into her sketches, her bedroom door closed more often than not. Nate stayed close to me, clinging to my side like he was afraid I'd disappear too. The house felt like a mausoleum, each room haunted by the ghosts of what had been and what could never be again. Claire left on a Thursday morning. She didn't say goodbye. She just loaded the last of her boxes into the car, gave the kids a long, tearful hug, and drove away. I watched from the front window, my chest heavy as her car disappeared down the street. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name, relief, maybe, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold, hollow ache that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. The kids were quiet that evening. Thomas locked himself in his room, the sound of his music muffled through the door. Ella sat on the couch, sketching silently, her eyes darting to me every so often. Nate curled up beside me, his head resting on my lap. I ran my fingers through his hair, trying to ignore the lump in my throat. A week passed. Then two. Life settled into a new, uneasy rhythm. The kids went to school. I went to work. The house was quieter now, emptier, but I forced myself to keep moving forward. Mark called me one afternoon, his voice sharp as ever. You still want me to keep tabs on Bruce and Claire? No, I said, the word surprising even me. I don't care what they do anymore. Mark let out a low chuckle. Good. They're not worth your time. He was right. They weren't. Claire had made her choices, and so had Bruce. They could live with the consequences. I wasn't going to waste another second chasing after people who didn't deserve my anger. One evening, as I sat in my office going through emails, there was a knock at the door. I looked up to see Thomas standing there, his arms crossed, his expression guarded. Can I come in? He asked. Of course, I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. He sat down, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he let out a heavy sigh. I'm sorry. I frowned. For what? For what I said. That I hated you. His voice was quiet, hesitant. I didn't mean it. I leaned forward, my elbows on the desk. I know you're angry, Thomas. And you have every right to be. But this, it wasn't your fault. None of it was. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and confusion. Why didn't you tell us the truth? I took a deep breath, the weight of the question pressing down on me. Because I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose between your mom and me. He nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing just a little. I don't know how to feel about her now. You don't have to figure it out all at once, I said. Take your time. Feel what you need to feel. But don't let her choices define you. He gave me a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. Ella came to me a few days later, her sketchbook in hand. She sat on the couch beside me, flipping through the pages until she found the one she wanted. It was a drawing of our family, or what used to be our family. Claire and I stood on either side of the kids, all of us smiling. But there was something off about it, something almost surreal. I drew this before everything happened, she said quietly. It doesn't feel real anymore. I looked at the drawing, my chest tightening. What do you mean? She shrugged, her gaze fixed on the page. We're all smiling, but it's fake. It's like I can see the cracks now. I didn't know what to say to that. She was right. The cracks had always been there, even if I hadn't noticed them. It's still a beautiful drawing, I said finally. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine. Do you think we'll ever feel real again? I hesitated, then reached out to squeeze her hand. I think we'll figure out a new real. It might take time, but we'll get there. She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Okay. The hardest part was Nate. He didn't understand why Claire was gone, why everything felt different. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with wide, tearful eyes. Is Mommy coming back? He asked. I froze, the question hitting me like a punch to the gut. She's not coming back to live here, I said gently. But she'll still see you. She loves you very much. He sniffled, clutching his stuffed bear tightly. Do you still love her? The question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to explain the tangled mess of emotions in my chest. I don't know, I said honestly. But I love you. And that will never change. He nodded, his little face scrunching up as he tried to hold back tears. I leaned down and kissed his forehead, my heart breaking all over again. Weeks turned into months. The divorce was finalized quietly, without fanfare. Claire moved into a small apartment across town, and Bruce all but disappeared from our lives. Margaret tried to reach out a few times, but I ignored her. I had nothing left to say to her. The kids and I found a new rhythm, a new normal. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was ours. We learned to navigate the cracks, to build something new from the wreckage. One evening, as I sat in the living room watching the sunset, Thomas came in and sat beside me. He didn't say anything, just handed me a beer and leaned back against the couch. Ella joined us a few minutes later, her sketchbook in hand. Then Nate, climbing onto my lap and curling up against my chest. For the first time in months, the house felt warm again. It wasn't the life I'd planned. But it was real. And that was enough. 3 years later, life had settled into something I could almost call peace. The house was quieter, the chaos of Claire's betrayal now a distant echo. The kids had grown, stronger, more independent, and wiser than they should have had to be. And me? I was still figuring it out, still learning to live with the weight of what had happened. But I was alive, and for the first time in years, I felt free. Thomas was 17 now, his shoulders broader, his voice deeper. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind that reminded me of the man I'd once hoped to be. He'd taken up carpentry, of all things, spending hours in the garage building furniture and restoring old pieces he found at thrift stores. It was his therapy, he said, a way to channel the anger he'd once carried like a second skin. Ella had turned 15 last month. She was taller now, her auburn hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Her sketchbooks were still scattered around the house, each one filled with the kind of raw, Emotional art that made you stop and look twice. She'd started entering local competitions, and last year, one of her pieces was selected for a gallery showing downtown. She didn't like to talk about her mom much, but I could see the pain linger in her eyes sometimes, especially when she thought no one was watching. And Nate. Sweet, stubborn Nate. At 12, he was the glue that held us together. His laughter filled the house, his energy a constant reminder that life moved forward, no matter how much you wanted to cling to the past. He'd taken up soccer, and every Saturday morning, I found myself on the sidelines, cheering him on like nothing else mattered. Claire had tried to rebuild her life too. She still lived in that small apartment across town, her job at the hospital barely keeping her afloat. She saw the kids on weekends, her time with them carefully divided and scheduled. I didn't interfere. That was her relationship to manage, and I wasn't going to stand in the way. But I also didn't go out of my way to make things easier for her. She'd called me once, about 6 months after the divorce, her voice tentative and heavy with regret. "Daniel," she'd said, I need you to know how sorry I am." I hadn't responded. I couldn't. Her apologies didn't matter anymore. The damage was done, and no amount of regret would undo the years of lies and betrayal. I hung up after a strained silence, and she never called again. Bruce? I didn't care. Whatever happened to him was his own doing. Last I heard, he'd lost his job after one of his schemes finally caught up with him. He was living in a rented room somewhere, a shadow of the man he'd once pretended to be. Margaret had tried to reach out as well, sending carefully worded letters and calling during the holidays. I ignored them all. She didn't deserve a place in my life, not after what she'd done. Her attempts at control had cost her everything, her family, her reputation, her influence. She'd built her empire on manipulation, and when it crumbled, she had no one to blame but herself. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I found myself in the backyard, the sun warm on my face. The garden was overgrown, the flowers tangled and wild, but there was a beauty in the chaos. Thomas was sanding a chair on the patio, his movements slow and methodical. Ella sat nearby, sketching the scene in her notebook, while Nate chased the dog around the yard, his laughter filling the air. I watched them, my chest tight with a mix of pride and sadness. They'd been through so much, seen too much, but they'd come out stronger. Resilient. They were my family, my reason to keep going. "Dad," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "What are you thinking about?" I looked at him, at the boy who was becoming a man right before my eyes. "Just how lucky I am," I said. He smirked, shaking his head. "You're such a sap." Ella laughed, the sound light and genuine. "He's allowed to be," she said. "He's earned it." I smiled, letting their banter wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the sky, I sat alone on the porch, a glass of whiskey in my hand. The house was quiet now, the kids asleep, the dog curled up at my feet. I thought about the past, about the years I'd spent building a life that turned out to be a lie. But I also thought about the future, about the life I was building now, a life built on truth, on resilience, on love that wasn't dependent on blood or perfection. I raised my glass to the stars, the weight in my chest finally lifting. To new beginnings. To moving forward. To the family we choose, not the one we're given.